Hi there, I'm Vlad and I'm a portrait photographer. I've been doing this for around 10 years and today I want to make a quick list of tips that are good for beginners but end up hurting your progress in the long run. And because I don't get paid to waste your time, let's jump straight into it. The first bad advice that I want to discuss today is the idea that you should take portraits outdoors in the shadows or better yet on overcast days. I think this is trying to steer people away from shooting in direct sunlight in the middle of the day where you're gonna get way too much contrast and you're not gonna get pleasing looking light on the face of your subject. But at the same time, because you don't have any kind of contrast on your subject's face, this is leading to boring looking photos down the line. Portraits that don't really have that punch or are not that memorable. Of course, they're not gonna be horrible photos, but at the same time, they're not gonna be amazing photos. So, let's assume you're a complete beginner and all you have is your camera. So, I'm not gonna suggest you to get a slide stand and either some diffusion fabric or a 5-in-1 reflector. Of course, this would help, but you don't have a ton of gear or don't want to be that weirdo with a ton of lights around your subject. So let's keep it simple and beginner friendly. First of all, avoid the middle of the day. At that point, the sun is way too bright and the shadows that it's casting are gonna be way too dark for you to recover them in post. And that's another thing that we really shouldn't do that much, but that's coming later in the video. Instead, try and shoot in the mornings and in the evenings. At that point in the day, the sun is not that bright and the shadows are not gonna be that harsh. And while shooting, try and have your subject have their nose point in the general direction of the source of the light. But don't ask people to look at the sun because they're gonna use their eyes and that's gonna lead to pain and people squinting in your photos. You don't want that as well, so have the subject point their nose in the general direction of the light. That's a good starting point. And if the light is slightly on one side of their face, try and get your camera on the other side of their nose. Again, just starting points and you can look more into how to illuminate people's face, but I'm assuming you are a complete beginner. And on overcast days, the sun is still behind of those clouds. So this tip still applies. If you have your subject point their face towards the place where the sun would be at the given time, you're still gonna get more highlights on that side of the face and you get less contrast, but you're still getting a bit of sculpting from the light if they're facing towards the place where the sun is behind of the clouds. Of course, we're not assuming thunderstorm clouds, but some light coverage. And to address the place your subject in the shadows part, I think that's a good way to get away from really strong contrast, but you're gonna need something like this simple reflector that I built in a previous short video, linked somewhere down below, and use that to redirect some light from a less shadowy area back into the shadow to illuminate your subject and create some contrast. Also, while placing your subject in a shadow, make sure the background behind of them is not hit by the sun because that can lead to bad contrast ratio between the subject and the background and can make your subject either look underexposed if you're correctly exposing for the background or if you're correctly exposing for the subject, it's gonna make your background look blown out. So the tip of placing your subject in a shadowy area for good looking portraits can cause a lot of problems if you don't know what you're doing. So if you're just starting out, I would rather not. And if you want to take this to the next level, I would strongly encourage you to get a friend and one of these silver reflectors. It gets really big and hard to control in the wind, but overall it's a nice way to redirect some light from the sun back into a dark area where you can have control over where the light is coming from. Of course, this is getting a bit more advanced, it's not that beginner friendly, but the photos that you're gonna get are gonna be much better. And one more time, keep in mind, I'm trying to keep this simple because the original tip was simple. We're gonna talk about more complicated stuff down the line towards the end of the video, but the original tip was super simple. Shoot on overcast day or shoot in the shadows, and instead I'm saying try and learn how to illuminate the face. It's easy, and if you put a bit of time into it, you're gonna get much better photos than you would get with flat light or light that you'd have on an overcast day. Next up, I want to talk about white balance. White balance in portraits is super important because that's the way we get natural looking skin tones. And the bad advice that I want to address here is the idea that we should fix the white balance in post-processing using the whites of our eyes. In a recent video I did with this color checker, I mean this gray card in the color checker, I showed you that in the shadows outdoors you have around 500 Kelvin less than you have in your highlights, meaning that your shadows are gonna be a bit bluer and your highlights are gonna be a bit warmer. And now when you're using the eyedropper to sample from the eye of the person in the photo, I have to ask you, is that eye in the highlights or in the shadows? And all that assuming that the whites of their eye is truly white and you're not compensating for whatever weirdness they have going on in the whites of their eyes. Because if you're sampling on a vein, you're gonna get a greenish looking photo. So I would say that this is a bad method to get a good white balance. And instead, we should try to aim our white balance to be in the sweet spot between what you would measure with a gray card on the highlight side of your face and on the shadow side of your face without this one being hit directly by the light. Now let me show you an example and an alternative method to settle the white balance in the photo without having to take measurements on the day of the shoot. So I've got this photo right here, only done some exposure adjustment. I'm also going to decrease the contrast just a tiny bit. And as you can see, the sclera from one of my eyes, the one that's in shadow, is covered by my eyelashes. And this one over here is also bad for sampling the white balance because the sun is hitting here on the side of my nose and this light is bouncing back into my eye, creating a very warm light that's hitting the sclera of my eye. And if I sample the white balance in here, what we're gonna get is something that's literally unusable. Instead, let me show you an alternative method. I'm gonna put the white balance slider all the way to the left and I'm gonna drag onto it until I don't feel that the photo is cold anymore. And I set that all at around 5000 Kelvin. Now I'm dragging the slider to the right until the photo is completely orange and starting to pull to the left until I don't feel that it's super warm anymore. And I think it's about here and that's 6200 Kelvin. Now I'm gonna split the difference and that's gonna yield me around 5700 Kelvin. Let's see how close I was to something that I measure with the color checker. And this is the same photo. I did my measurement with the color checker in the shadows and in the highlights. And over here I settled for 5600 Kelvin, and that's super close to what I got with my eyeballing method. Of course, it's more time consuming and probably less precise, but it's a good alternative if you didn't take any measurement while you were shooting, and it's way better than getting the white balance from the sclera of the person in the photo. And since I was already talking about white balance, that's one more thing that I wanted to address while I was editing this video. I don't think that we always have to hit a perfect white balance. It's perfectly fine to have orange looking skin in a sunset photo or anything like that that helps us tell a good story. So don't go crazy chasing the perfect white balance if what you're trying to do is tell a good story with your portraits. Now back to the original video. Another advice that's becoming a bit of an obsession with some people is the idea that you should avoid clipping at all cost. Because sometimes some scenes are super high dynamic range. And guess what? If you're gonna have the sun in frame, that sun is going to blow out. You don't want to blow out your subject, but there's not a problem if some part of the photo is super bright and you're translating that into your image. And the worst thing is that some people take this so literal that they are underexposing their subject by more than one stop in order to prevent some background highlight from clipping. That's bad. You should try and expose for your subject. If something is clipping in the background, either want it to be there or you should reframe your shot. Don't obsess about something that's clipping which is not your subject. Yeah, highlights are distracting, and if you have too many of them in the background, you're better off adding some light on your subject or just reframing your shot. But don't go crazy about the fact that you clipped the sun or some kind of flare on the background of your photo and underexpose your subject, because when you put that photo into post-processing, you're gonna raise the shadows and introduce a ton of noise in the final photo. And that's worse than any kind of random highlight in the background. Because at the end of the day, we're gonna look at the subject no matter what, because that's a person in the frame and we're not looking for the highlight in the background. So that was my rant and the advice number 3. And before we go to the advice number 4, which might ruin your portrait photos, make sure to hit the buttons if you enjoyed the video so far, because that helps me greatly and will allow me to create more videos like this one. Finally, the advice number 4 that I want to debate today is the idea that we should recover details in all of our shadows and highlights. Because, yeah, we should have details on a person's face, even in the darker areas. But do you really need to see every individual strand of hair in my dark beard? Or do you really need to see what's in that bookshelf over there? And in this case, my honest answer is no. But if I would be to erase the shadows in this shot, you would see everything. And that would become distracting really fast. And that's not all. When we're globally raising the shadows by a lot in our photos, we're not only exposing all the little details, but we're also ruining the contrast ratio between shadows and midtones. And just to prove my point, here's the self-portrait. I'm going to increase the shadows by a lot to recover the details in the shadows. And I'm going to decrease the highlights by a lot to recover all the details that I might be losing in my highlights. I'm going to create a virtual copy, and instead of doing that, I'm going to raise my black level to get back some details in the shadow, but maintain the contrast ratio in the image. And I would do the same for my whites, but you can see that I'm not even close to clipping in this image, so I don't feel the need to do that. And now let's compare the two photos and see what we got. On the one on the bottom, you can see that although the photo is much brighter because I lifted the black point, I'm getting a ton of contrast. While up there, the photo is kind of muddy. I got no highlights because I was toning down the highlights to get more details in my highlights. And overall, I would feel the need to come in here and increase both the brightness and the contrast to get a better looking photo. Now, the image looks a bit crunchy because there are too many details and too much contrast in between those details. So, the advice that you should recover all the possible details out of the photo is more of an obsession with capturing as much data as possible. When in reality, if you wanna go for cinematic looking photos, a bit of darkness or some bright highlights are actually something you would desire. And before I end this video, I have to admit that I was one of the people who are kind of obsessed with recovering details. Afterwards, I would come in and leave my black points and do all kind of mumbo jumbos to compensate for the mistake that I was doing in the beginning of my edit. And you can see this in some of my early videos on this channel as well. But nowadays, I try to balance the highlights and the shadows in such a way that they look more natural. And at the same time, I want my highlights to feel bright in an image. So if I pull down the highlights too much, that would just look like a ton of details and not a bright spot. And the same thing goes for shadows. I want my shadows to feel dark in the final shot. Because at the end of the day, if the contrast wouldn't be that great to begin with, why would I have pointed my camera and taken the picture? The reality is, I wouldn't. And that's exactly my idea. If I took the picture, it means that I liked the contrast. So why would I mess it up while editing? That was it for today. Thank you for watching, and if you want to support me and the work that I'm doing, please also check out my website where I'll sell Lightroom presets and tools that will help you emulate film for your own photography. That was it for today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.